Slavery was once widespread throughout Tamriel, and unfortunately in the continent's history it has been rather racially motivated. Most commonly it has been the races of Mer enslaving the races of men, or others they consider less than, those not made in Auriel's divine image. For the Ultima of the Somerset Isles it was the use of goblins, for the Aelids of Cyrodiil it was the enslavement of entire tribes of men, subject to vile tortures and labours. And for the Durrani elves of High Rock it was the forced peasantry of the Needs under their strict caste system. But these are customs of the past for most of Tamriel and the Empire of Man, which have had great influence on the realm and were resolved to a position of staunch anti-slavery, considering their ancient past as Needic slaves under the tyranny of the Aelid kings. There remained one exception, though, to the fading of slavery, and that exception was Morrowind. Since before the Dark Elves were known as such, they were the Chimer, and it was said that even then they captured Argonian slaves and used them to toil in the inhospitable conditions of the mines and wetlands of Morrowind. And even beyond the ascendancy of the Tribunal and the people's transformation into the Ashen-skinned Dunmer, the Elves of Morrowind continued their tradition of slavery, and in fact only expanded it, given their civilization's proliferation under the Golden Age of divine instruction by living gods. The Dunmer are known as notoriously xenophobic, with the worst of them considering all but themselves subhuman, or should I say sub-Mer, useful only to serve as labour. However, there are of course those who oppose such cruelty, and those who have steadfast belief in the right to freedom. Welcome back to Fudge Muppet, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Scott, and today I want to talk to you about slavery in Morrowind and the secretive organisation known as the Twin Lamps, the brave souls who harried many slaves from the oppression of this alien land and back to their home, back to freedom. Now, you may well know that by the end of the Third Era, King Hlaalu Helseth officially renounced the slave trade of Morrowind, overturning the Great House's right to ancestral practice. However, we are going to be talking about the period where the slave trade flourished and how it was counteracted from within. Slavery as a practice had been maintained for thousands of years in Morrowind, essentially since its conception, as well throughout the First and Second Eras. However, come the time of Tiber Septim's conquests, it seemed that the traditional ways of the Dunmer were at risk of changing. Slavery was and is illegal throughout the entirety of the Empire, and that same Empire was at their doorstep. However, Vivek, one of the living gods of the Tribunal, foresaw their eventual demise in war, and so entered a deal with Tiber Septim preemptively. An armistice was signed, and Morrowind was incorporated into the territories of the Third Empire. The Empire gained the Numidium, they gained the ability to place various forts and towns throughout, and they gained a monopoly on ebony and Dwemer artifacts via the East Empire Trading Company. However, in return, by the terms of the armistice, Morrowind was able to define its own laws and customs, and slavery remained legal. Throughout all that land, slavery occurred in greater and lesser degrees, depending on where. House Hlaalu, seeking to ingratiate themselves with the side of progress and imperial law, engaged in slavery far less. House Redorand's codes of duty and piety would often run counterintuitive to the practice of owning slaves. Not that they thought it was abhorrent or anything, just its practice in Redoran lands was less common. However, houses Indoril, Telvanni, and Dress had no such quandaries or considerations. House Dress specifically was the centerpiece of the entire slave trade. They ruled the southern lands, the Deshaan plains that border the swamps leading into Blackmarsh. Quote from the Great Houses of Morrowind: House Dress is an agrarian agricultural society, and its large salt rice plantations rely completely on slave labor for their economic viability. Always firm temple supporters, House Dress is hostile to imperial law and culture, and in particular opposed to any attempts to limit the institution of slavery. For House Dress, the capture and export of slaves from Blackmarsh was vital to their economy and political power. One need only look to their banner, marked with a chain of bondage as their sigil, to understand how vital slavery was to the success of House Dress. We need only look to their founding as a great house established in the First Era, when the Grandmaster Thalthil Dress led a successful slave raid on the city of Thorn in Blackmarsh and amassed great power because of it. Their salt rice fields are responsible for feeding the rest of Morrowind, and they are worked almost exclusively by the calloused hands of Argonian and Khajiit slaves, whipped and chained into a life of servitude and submission. In fact, throughout the Third Era, despite the illegality of slavery outside of Morrowind, House Dress would still engage in slave raids to the south, and the Empire was either uncaring or unable to properly hold them responsible, and so slaves were still in abundance and sold all over Morrowind, especially to the wizard lords of the House Telvanni, who believe in such values as might makes right, and of course many Dunmer would relish in having slaves to work their plantations for them, such as we see on the Isle of Vardenfell in the southern regions. If one were to oppose the cruel and barbaric ways of slavery, then it would be House Dress that embodies their enemy most. Dress are the polar opposite of House Hlaalu. They are self-described isolationists, even by Dunmer standards, still holding tightly to their worship of Daedra and ancestor reverence. Arguably, they only maintained ties with the rest of the great houses because of the economic benefits of trade and mutual protection. Whereas on the other hand, we have House Hlaalu, who are pro-imperialization and saw the benefit of forward thinking and progress, and so it is no surprise that you may find individuals within their house who abhor the use of slaves. Meet Ilmeni Dren, a high-ranking member of House Hlaalu and daughter of Duke Vadim Dren, who was both the Grandmaster of House Hlaalu and Duke of the Imperial District of Vardenfell, part of Imperial administration. Ilmeni Dren herself was one of Morrowind's most prominent anti-slavery advocates and the leader of the enigmatic Twin Lamps organization. Members that belong to this organization are united by a common ideal, one that states that the ownership of another is morally wrong and that mortals should have the right to self-determination rather than be forced into bondage. Members would recognize each other using a specific response to a specific phrase. Ask, "Have you seen the Twin Lamps?" To which another would reply, "They light the way to freedom." And of course, this phrase gives the name of the organization the Twin Lamps. By its controversial nature, the Twin Lamps relies on discreet tactics and secretive instruction in order to further their goals of liberating slaves. Kalaya is an Argonian mage in Ebonheart who works as a consul, which, if you do not know, is an official appointed by the state to live in a foreign city and protect the state's citizens and interests. Kalaya is acting on behalf of Argonian interest in their embassy in Ebonheart. While on the surface he appears merely as a diplomat here to exchange words and discuss policy, he is secretly a high-ranking member of the Twin Lamps, along with several other Argonians here such as Onasha, Andesai, Ukwe, and Gila. Together, these Argonians act as a funnel for slaves out of Morrowind, Argonian, Khajiit, or any once bound in chains against their will. But for this operation to succeed, the Twin Lamps rely heavily upon a network of people who share their interests, such as the aforementioned Ilmeni Dren, who helps orchestrate the operation as their leader, but there are many other brave souls who risk much trying to free slaves. Remember, in Morrowind, slavery was legal, and property theft was illegal, so what the Twin Lamps were doing, according to Morrowind's laws at the time, was entirely unjust. Galen Avel is a dark elf woman who arranges safe travel for slaves at the docks of Old Velothi. Sturdakan is a Redguard farmer in the northern Asgadian Isles who provides shelter for escaped slaves from nearby plantations, and there is also Jorbasha, a book merchant in Vivek's foreign quarter, who helps the Twin Lamps and has even rewarded those that help free slaves of their own accord. Interestingly, he also has an ordinator in his store that is said to be appointed by none other than Duke Vadim Dren, father of Ilmeni Dren, so perhaps she has convinced her father of the Twin Lamps' cause, and under the table he affords special protections and assistance. I mean, after all, it seems kind of strange that the Duke would be unaware with his resources that the Twin Lamps organization is running out of the Argonian mission in Ebonheart, where he himself resides. Now, it may be fair to say that the abolitionist movements flourished under the Empire and would eventually result in its official outlaw by King Hlaalu Helseth, which, mind you, belongs to what is essentially an imperial puppet monarchy installed by Tiber Septim, beginning with Queen Baranzaya. However, that is not to say that there were not anti-slavery movements in Morrowind's past. Under the terms of the Ebonheart Pact in the Second Era, there was a fleeting moment of historical significance where the Dunmer of houses Redoran, Hlaalu, and Indoril agreed to the abolition of slavery, yet houses Dress and Telvanni made no such agreement and maintained their slavery practices. As the Ebonheart Pact fell apart, slavery was quickly returned to the rest of Morrowind once more. There was also the ancient faction of Dunmer Thieves, known as the Bal Malagma, which translates to Stonefire Men, who righted the wrongs of injustice by stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, Robin Hood style. It was also said that, unlike many of their counterparts at the time, they opposed slavery as a practice. The Bal Malagma seemingly vanished in the early Third Era though. While it took thousands of years, the practice of slavery was abolished in Morrowind by the end of the Third Era, an administrative decision that resulted in quite the civil strife. Of course then, there was the destruction of the Oblivion crisis, followed by the eruption of Red Mountain and the Argonian invasion at the hands of the Anzaleel. The Argonian invasion force washed over the Deshaan Plains and all of southern Morrowind, taking revenge for a millennia of persecution until they were stopped by the forces of House Redoran. Now, it is hard to determine the fate of slavery in 4th Era Morrowind. While it would be fair to say that with both its legal status denied and the retribution of the Argonian armies that the Dunmer have finally foregone their practice of slavery for good, I can also see on the other hand how clandestine slavering operations may continue, especially now that the Empire's hold has weakened. But then again, perhaps mainstream opinions really have changed and certain Dunmer traditions have been forsaken. It would be hard to say unless we ever visited Morrowind in the 4th Era, but overall, thanks to the efforts of the Twin Lamps and many others who fought for abolition, slavery has become, for the most part, a barbaric practice of ancient history, a place where the practice should most definitely stay. Thanks for watching, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Scott from Fudge Muppet, and I hope you learnt a little bit about slavery and its opposition in Morrowind. Like the video if you enjoyed, subscribe for more, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.